This is Words Are Bridges. In the past few weeks, we've been bringing you great conversation, and we hope that you've been watching and enjoying it. If you've missed any, you can find all of them on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Lit Fest GLF. And now for a brand new episode of Words Are Bridges, a series and initiative by the Jaipur Literature Festival in partnership with HarperCollins India.
Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सरी कदल तारान
വഹൈനഥോൻ
आखर हमार मेल सन आखर हमार जोड़
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kaina siam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati kisale.
Grauthaining yaukrai.
Shabda setu hon.
शब्दां दी सांस।
Words Are Bridges celebrates language and the magic of language. It celebrates literature and translation and the power it has to connect us across cultures and borders and countries. In our first season, we are talking to eminent writers writing across Indian languages. And we hope to bring to you some of that joy and pleasure that comes from great conversation and great literature. But before we begin, I'd like to invite Namita Gokhale, co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival, Sanjoy Roy, producer of the Jaipur Literature Festival, and my colleague, publisher Udayan Mitra from HarperCollins India, to welcome all of you.
We are lovers of books and literature. Words travel, ideas travel, stories travel. We welcome you to our new digital platform, Words Are Bridges. This important initiative looks at the act of translation as a mediation between languages and culture, between time and place. India's unique literary landscape, with its rich diversity and its absolutely staggering multilinguality, will be explored through a fascinating series of sessions that bring together writers, translators, and commentators. We at JLF are delighted to partner with HarperCollins India to expand our horizons of reading as we listen in to the original text and also examine its resonance through translations. Thank you.
Stories provide us place, context, culture, and tradition. In India, with our vast diversity of linguistic traditions, we often don't have access to each other's content. The Jaipur Literature Festival brings to you Words Are Bridges to explore translation and writing from across India in association with HarperCollins.
At HarperCollins, we've always watched with delight as words build bridges, as the books that we publish introduce readers to worlds often unknown to them. This is especially true of our translations, which wonderfully connect cultures through the written word. Today, unfortunately, readers and writers are feeling more isolated than ever before. JLF's Words Are Bridges is a lovely initiative to connect us all over again. We at HarperCollins are really excited to be part of this program.
Thank you so much, Namita, Sanjoy, and Udayan. Our session today is Once It Flowers, the fiction of Vinod Kumar Shukla. Presenting Vinod Kumar Shukla, Satti Khanna in conversation with Mohini Gupta. Renowned for bringing the marvellous to the ordinary, Vinod Kumar Shukla has long been recognized as one of India's foremost writers, with his unique stories that deal with smaller-than-life people. Mohini Gupta is a writer and translator based in New Delhi. She has been a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow in 2017 and a Sangam House Translator in Residence in 2015. Her translations have been published by Tulika Publishers. She runs a digital Indian poetry collective for young readers, Mother's Tongue Twisters, and hosts conversations on poetry, Indian language, and translation. Satti Khanna is Associate Professor at Duke University, where he teaches Indian cinema and modern Hindi literature. He interprets the lives and works of contemporary writers to an international audience through a series of documentary films and translations. He has translated Vinod Kumar Shukla's Naukar Ki Kameez, The Servant's Shirt, and his novels Diwar Mein Ek Khirki Rehti Thi, A Window Lived in the Wall, Khilega To Dekhenge, Once It Flowers, Hari Ghaas Ki Chhappar Wali Jhopdi Aur Bona Pahad, Moonrise from the Green Grass Roof. He has also translated Mohan Rakesh's Aakhri Chattan Tak, To the Farthest Rock, and Suryakant Tripathi Nirala's Kulli Bhat, A Life Misspent. His translation of Vinod Kumar Shukla's Ek Chupi Jagah, The Silent Place, is slated for publication in 2021. Vinod Kumar Shukla is known for his unusual style of writing that often borders on magical realism. His most important works include the novels Naukar Ki Kameez, made into a movie by Mani Kaul, Khilega To Dekhenge, and Diwar Mein Ek Khirki Rehti Thi, which won the Sahitya Akademi Award in 1999. Please do comment by typing them in the comments section. Do follow our handles JLF Litfest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to be updated about our upcoming sessions. And in case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues during the session, don't worry, you can find us again on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Once It Flowers.
Hi everyone, I'm really delighted and honored to be in conversation today with Professor Satti Khanna. Satti has translated 6 novels by Vinod Kumar Shukla ji, as we know, and also works by Suryakant Tripathi Nirala and Mohan Rakesh, all stalwarts of the Hindi literary world. But today the writer in focus is Mr. Vinod Kumar Shukla. Vinod-ji, I believe, is one of the greatest Hindi poets and novelists of our times. He's been writing for over half a century now and currently resides in Jaipur. We will also hear from him during the session, so please stay tuned. His novel, Diwar Mein Ek Khirki Rehti Thi, which is A Window Lived in a Wall, translated by Satti Khanna, won the Sahitya Akademi Award for the Best Hindi Work in 1999. His novel, Naukar Ki Kameez, or The Servant's Shirt, was made into a movie directed by Mani Kaul as well. He continues to write today and is by far one of the most unique and refreshing contemporary voices in Hindi literature. His writing, I think, is as ordinary as it is extraordinary, rooted in the local and yet extremely magical and universal. And I think the quality of his imaginative fiction remains timeless and always will. According to Sahitya Akademi Award-winning poet and critic Ashok Vajpayee, Vinod Kumar Shukla has no predecessors nor any heirs, and I completely agree with him. Professor Satti Khanna is here with us today to discuss Vinod Kumar Shukla's work in the context of his own translations over the years. Satti, welcome to the session. It's really great to have you here and also meet you again in the virtual world. We were earlier in conversation during the launch of your translation of Nirala's memoir, Kulli Bhat, or A Life Misspent, which was also published by HarperCollins India, who really played an incredible role in bringing some leading voices from Indian languages into English. So Satti, once again, welcome to the session.
Thank you.
And shall we start maybe with a reading of your translation from Vinod-ji's novel, Khilega To Dekhenge, or Once It Flowers? We can then move into questions and answers later.
The banyan tree was big. Its roots, no doubt on account of the substation nearby, secretly penetrated deep into the ground. There were only 2 brick buildings here, the village extension workers' quarters and the police substation. Compared to the other thatched dwellings in the village, both looked grand. The police substation was not in use. It had been abandoned over a year ago. When it was built, it was situated at what must have seemed the center of habitation. Now, the center and the police had shifted to nearby Badgaon. Badgaon boasted a sizable population. A rice mill had just been built. There was a timber business with electric saws. There was a flour mill and a middle school. All this activity required a police substation. But in the small village, the old substation looked like a security guard with handlebar mustaches, assigned to provide protection and care to 3 or 4 poor people. The villagers did not use the path by the banyan tree, even though the substation lay empty. Goats that thought nothing of interrupting the primary school teacher by vaulting up the veranda into his classroom avoided the substation. Sometimes cows strayed that way. The herder would be frightened and call out to them to turn back. The cows paid no attention. No harm came to them, probably because of the protection they enjoyed as cows. In the schoolroom, Guruji shouted out the day's lessons to his students. The students repeated the words loudly after him. The din was deafening. A tiger would have bounded out of the jungle to escape such cries and been hunted down immediately. The goats, on the other hand, were not perturbed. They could be seen happily running up and down the schoolhouse veranda. There was a sweet-water well in the substation compound. Had there been no substation adjacent to it, the well would have attracted other dwellers. But even though it had been empty for a long time, the village didn't extend towards the police station by so much as a hut. It kept its distance as before. The old village watchman continued to sweep the grounds and refill the water pot on the veranda of the deserted substation with water from the well. When the clay water pot cracked, he would claim free replacement from the potter, since the water pot was intended for the police. He believed in keeping the old substation ready in case an official stopped by on a tour of duty. He imagined the official would stay at the substation and address the village assembly outside Jivrakhan's shop. Nobody had told the watchman it was important to keep the substation spruced up. He did it on his own. The government official would arrive with his papers and draw up a chair on Jivrakhan's veranda. The villagers would squat below, indicating that they did not claim equal dignity with the official. If it happened to rain while they were squatting, they stayed put, even if a strong shower drenched them. They would wait in the shower till the official finished gathering his papers and dismissed the assembly. Sometimes it took the official only a couple of minutes to gather his papers. At other times, a full 4 or 5. If the rain was light, the official continued his work, and the people sitting out in the open did not disband. There was a large peepal tree not far from Jivrakhan's shop. In the monsoon, the first arrivals for an assembly sat nearest the trunk in case it rained. But when the official appeared and drew up his chair, the villagers would notice the empty space between them and Jivrakhan's shop and think it proper to fill that space. They moved ahead till the peepal tree's shelter lay far behind the last man in the assembly. This would happen in the summer as well. The villagers would squat near the veranda while the peepal's shade remained arranged about the tree trunk. If the shade drifted down from the tree the way leaves fell, there would be enough shade for each person to gather and wear on his head. On the other hand, if such assemblies continued to take place in front of Jivrakhan's shop for 100 years, the shade from the peepal tree would probably extend all the way to it. The continual growing of a tree is a natural thing. The tree doesn't grow by using its brains, it grows according to its nature. If the people used brains, it would have grown towards Jivrakhan's shop from the beginning. Jivrakhan had opened his shop 7 or 8 years ago. He could have chosen a site nearer the peepal tree if he wished. He owned land in a number of nearby villages. He was a rich farmer. Some village elders liked to sit by the peepal tree. Their grey presence made the leafy tree look ancient, a solitary giant in a dust-blown landscape. Its leaves made soft slapping sounds when the wind blew. The entire village was like a melancholy performance which had been going on for ages. It was the performance that mattered, not whether it grew out of suffering. If the village performed suffering well, there was instant applause.
मुझसे ये अक्सर पूछा जाता है कि मैंने जो थोड़े से उपन्यास लिखे हैं उनमें मुझे सबसे अच्छा उपन्यास कौन सा लगता है। तब मैं अपने को बचाने की कोशिश करता हूँ, इसका उत्तर नहीं देता, क्योंकि ये बड़ा मुश्किल है। दूसरों को बताने के लिए बड़ा कठिन उत्तर है। पर मैं जब अपने आप से पूछता हूँ कि मुझे अपने लिखे उपन्यासों में किस उपन्यास को लिखने के बाद में संतुष्टि मिली, अच्छा लगा, तो मैं कहना चाहता हूँ कि वह उपन्यास है खेलेगा तो देखेंगे। इसको लिखने के बाद मुझको लगा कि जैसे मैंने कोई एक बहुत कठिन सी बात थी जो मुझे कहनी थी और मैंने उसे कहने की कोशिश की। यह उपन्यास सच्चाई के छोटे छोटे टुकड़ों से गूंथा हुआ उपन्यास है। इसे मैंने कल्पना के सूत्र से गूंथा है और मैं इस उपन्यास के अनुवाद के बारे में भी मैं कहना चाहूँगा कि इस उपन्यास का अनुवाद जिसे सत्ती खन्ना ने किया है, इस अनुवाद के लिए वो कई बार मुझसे रायपुर आकर मुझसे मिले हैं और ये उपन्यास का अनुवाद उन्होंने जो किया है, मुझे ये उपन्यास का जो अनुवाद है अंग्रेजी में, उससे भी मैं पूरी तरह से संतुष्ट हूँ। मुझे अच्छा लगा। ये उपन्यास थोड़ा सा शिल्प के मामले में कुछ कठिन है। पठनीयता के तौर पर इसका शिल्प कठिन है। वैसे यह हमेशा मेरे साथ में होता है कि लिखने के बाद मैं जो लिख रहा होता हूँ वो मालूम होता है, लेकिन ये कितनी अजीब बात है कि लिखने के पहले मुझे क्या लिखना है ये मुझे मालूम नहीं होता। और एक समय मेरी जिंदगी का जब मैं लिखने शुरू करता हूँ तो वो सारा समय बीता हुआ, अभी का समय जिसमें मैं लिख रहा हूँ और आने वाला समय जिसमें मेरा लिखना पूरा होगा, वो सारा समय आकर के इकट्ठा हो जाता है मेरे पास में। एक ये भी मैं कहना चाहता हूँ कि इस उपन्यास को जो यथार्थ के छोटे छोटे टुकड़ों में है और जिसे मैंने कल्पना के सूत्र से गूंथा हुआ है, इसमें एक महत्वपूर्ण बात मुझको अपने कहने में ये लगती है, प्राय मैं अपने हर लिखने में ये कोशिश करता हूँ कि, और मुझे ऐसा जान पड़ता है, ऐसा मेरा विश्वास है कि यथार्थ में इतनी ताकत नहीं है कि वह कल्पना को परास्त कर सके। खिलेगा तो देखेंगे इस उपन्यास में अत्यधिक स्थानीयता है। यह स्थानीयता इतनी अधिक है कि ये आदि जीवन की स्थापना की, आदि जीवन के इसकी स्थानीयता उसके समीप तक पहुंच गई है। और मैं इस पर भी विश्वास करता हूं कि बिना स्थानीय हुए मैं वैश्विक नहीं हो सकता, और वैश्विक होने के लिए मैं ये ज़रूरी मानता हूं कि स्थानीयता ज़रूरी है। एक बात और मैं कहना चाहता हूं कि कोई भी लेखक जिसमें मैं शामिल हूं अपने को अलग नहीं करता। मैं अपना सर्वश्रेष्ठ कभी लिख नहीं पाता हूं। मैं इस बात की कोशिश ज़रूर करता हूं कि मैंने जो पिछला लिखा है उससे मैं ज़्यादा कुछ बेहतर और अच्छा लिखने की, जो नहीं लिखा है, जैसा नहीं लिखा है वैसा लिखने की मैं कोशिश करूं। मैं नहीं जानता कि मैं इस कोशिश में कितना कामयाब होता हूं या कामयाब नहीं होता हूं। और तो मैं ये कह रहा था कि अपना सर्वश्रेष्ठ लिखने के लिए प्रत्येक लेखक अपनी कोशिश करता है, लेकिन अपने लिखने की उम्र तक वो अपना सर्वश्रेष्ठ नहीं लिख पाता, और उसका सर्वश्रेष्ठ लिखा जाना हमेशा बचा रहता है। और उसके साथ में ये उम्मीद भी बची रहती है लेखक के साथ में कि उसके बाद की पीढ़ी का जो लेखन होगा वो इसके बाद का सर्वश्रेष्ठ होगा। मैं अपने आप को एक साधारण और सामान्य सा लेखक मानता हूँ और अपनी साधारण सी बातें जो होती हैं, जो अकारण जो है ऊपरी दृष्टि से छूट जाती हैं, वो मुझे ज़्यादा स्पष्ट दिखाई देती हैं। मैं उसी जो साधारण सी बातें हैं उनको स्पष्ट देखकर लिखने की कोशिश करता हूँ।
बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया विनोद जी. I'm always in awe of the way he very simply and profoundly articulates his thoughts about his work, about life, about absolutely anything at all. Satti, it's such a pleasure to hear him. What are your thoughts, or what struck you when he was talking about the novel?
It's equally a pleasure for me to hear him. The weight of his presence and thought infuses everything he says. What struck me hearing him this time around was his remarking on the ordinariness of the life he renders, that instead of a passing glance over things, he can hold his gaze steady at the innerness that accompanies it. So very ordinary life. And as we know from his fiction, no dramatic plot or incident gives it momentum. It's this quality of such open observation that nothing seems to lack innerness, not a squirrel, not a tree, not a rock, not a stream. The world is animate with being and awareness, and that's not a light acquisition. When he says that he believes that imagination is not unequal to the worst that fate can bring, the suffering around him is vivid to him. I recall an earlier conversation with him, which is part of the epilogue to Once It Flowers, and he's talking about the pain that he had to evoke in the course of his journey through this, often tender and delicious novel. And if I may read from his closing comments, he says, I like Khilega to Dekhenge. It is the most incompletely finished of my novels. It turned into a novel of suffering while I debated in my mind about other things I wanted to say. I'll put them in later, I thought to myself. I wrote the novel during my fellowship at Nirala Srijanpeeth, Bhopal. I lived alone in Bhopal while my wife and children stayed on in Jaipur. I was suffering from terrible sores in my mouth then. When I drank water, I could feel the sores slip down and spread into the lining of my stomach. After writing Khilega to Dekhenge, Once It Flowers, I was able to write Diwar Mein Ek Khidki Rehti Thi, A Window Lived in the Wall. It was a novel about the happiness of married life. I'm glad I was able to search out that happiness. So what I'm saying is that when he says imagination is equal to the worst that people can live with, it's an earned statement, not a liberal sentiment. So that struck me. The other thing that struck me was his reminder of the local as his window to the souls of people, and his reminder that things are global not because they happen to have global references, but because they penetrate to what makes us global, because we are human. And the clarity, the lucidity of his effort rendered that way, it's very moving.
You're right, and the effortlessness with which he said, it's because I am so rooted in the local that I can be global or universal, was really, really profound. So thank you. Thanks, Satti, for also reading out from your previous interview with him, which is in Once in Flowers. I actually, I have many questions about your translation process and the way you've been able to capture his tone, his simplicity, and all of those things into the English. But before that, I want to go back to when you first connected with his work. So when did you really, what was the first thing you read by him? And how did the first translation, which was of Naukar Ki Kameez, which you translated as The Servant's Shirt, how did that come into existence?
Vinod-ji will understand this, but most of the interesting parts of life's journey are the happenstance, akaran, as he says, for no reason, gifts of life fall into one's hands. So I was at the Bombay International Film Festival in 1991, freighting a film by a Harvard anthropologist, Robert Gardner, on Banaras called Forest of Bliss. This was at Manikal's request to bring the film over. And in conversation, I was telling Manikal about a project which had arisen to make some films for Doordarshan about, this is in the early 90s, about what we called then regional writers. And the idea was to introduce, well, my idea was to introduce what I would call poets or writers to a wider audience in India. Wherever we don't know people, we imagine that the layers of life are thinner than where we live, and every turn has a new view. So I began writing to friends and asking friends whom they would recommend as a writer in Uriya or Malayalam or Tamil or Bengali. And Mani suggested that I read Vinod Kumar Shukla's Naukar Ki Kameez, which I did. And I'm an expatriate in the sense I live in the US. And so the vividness of the local and I can only say the patience of the narrative with the ups and downs of life and ups and downs of lower middle class life, about which I'll say something a little later, made a tremendous impression on me. And I was very lucky that I could indeed go to Jaipur and meet Shukla-ji and make a short film about him and read his poetry and grasp for myself the coherence of his vision, that it drew on the indigenous life and the local life and on his own capacity to find a distance from the aspirational world into which somebody with his training and education would have been to which they would have been drawn. And the small comment I wanted to make was, so if we read a work like Shukla-ji's novel, the full human universe is present before us. There's no sense of entering an unfamiliar terrain in order to acquire some knowledge about it. Once we are in the novel, we are inside the space of choosing, longing, attraction, safety. And I think, by way of contrast of, say, most Bollywood films, which present that aspirational universe repeatedly, as if looking below that surface, say as in Dhobi Ghat, is an extraordinary attainment. We are now learning about the people who live in chawls. So those things. And also I might say the music of the language. As you listening to the interview remarked on the simplicity which sustained the insight, the novel is full of that. I was lucky that other friends who heard me praise the novel to the skies said, well, why don't you do a translation if it matters that much to you? And that's how I came to work on it, and then was lucky to find a publisher.
I also really liked what you said in an earlier conversation that we'd had about how there was no altruism in your act of translation. It really came from your desire to be intimate with the worlds that he has created. You wanted to linger a little bit in the world of Santu Babu and just the characters that he'd created. So I really also liked that idea of translation being your way of sort of just living in that world for a little bit longer than you would have otherwise.
No, it's true. It's true also with the other works I've had the luck to translate, Renu or Rakesh or Nirala, it's really being allowed to stay on in their living room. And who would part from such intense company?
Oh, yes, that was a really beautiful image. I want to come back to what we were talking about, his tone that you've captured in the English. So like we said, you know, how he creates these very mundane situations, very everyday situations. There's no real, like you said, dramatic plot in the novel, but there is something extraordinary happening at the same time. There's something magical happening. And he writes in very simple prose. And in fact, his fiction has also been called a poet's fiction, where it is very poetic the way he writes. So my question really is, what was the most difficult element for you to replicate when you were translating this into the English?
Allow me to make a comment about the word replicate, which I know is our shorthand for whatever that process is. But my view of art and literature is that anything presented to a living being is a series of cues and hints and suggestions which are realized by the individual human being. The quality of a work derives not from where it's located or how tight the plot is or what the message is. In my view, it depends on the degree of enlivening, what I might call the degree of coming to oneself, which the novel or the poem or the movie calls for. And so my bias is to figure out a way of arranging cues so that the reader of the translation is enlivened. And this is in some ways a more difficult aspiration than the aspiration of expressing what's in us, because we have a surface reality which the original presents, and the cues we get because we are keyed to that culture, and then the task of arranging cues and hints and rhythms so that somebody unfamiliar with whatever we call the original is still able to experience themselves differently. So what was most difficult to replicate was the enlivening effect of his prose. Both that it was heading somewhere and I couldn't quite tell when it would turn and find at the moment a novel association, but however he writes his music, later resonant in the appropriate place. So that was difficult. It remains difficult as he has been writing books, and especially now that I've been translating his books for children, the style becomes simpler, like something that's been rubbed down through the centuries and not written in Jaipur in the early 21st century. And to catch that simplicity, it's like having to write nursery rhymes so they would endure. Difficult.
And I've noticed that there isn't much difference in the way he writes the novels, the first 3 novels which are for adults, but also the last 3 novels which are for children. There's not much of a difference in his tone. I think the amazing thing is that he talks to the adults in children as well. I don't think there's like a talking down at all. I think he remains simple in his writing for all ages of readers, which I find quite fascinating as well. I think the other element that I wanted to ask you about was how culturally rooted he is. We've spoken about this as well, about how he remains local and yet becomes universal. But I want to talk about the local and what were the decisions that you had to take to sustain this sort of local flavor of the text, especially in a novel like Khirega to Dekhenge or Once It Flowers. There's Guruji, there's Jeev Rakhan, there's all of the things that are going on with their lives. So just some of the decisions, if you can give us examples of what you had to do, what you struggled with maybe.
Yeah. Can I just cut in with an afterthought on what Shukla-ji had said a little earlier? So he talks about the power of the imagination, which somehow endures at the worst of times. And I'm thinking of, say, his use of imagination in his fictional work. So people in that same level tone slip from buttoning their shirt to imagining themselves caught out by Bade Babu for not having buttoned their shirt, and the life that would ensue. And we read this as if it were historical present tense in the material world. In that novel, which he says allowed him to dream of happiness in fiction, the novel Diwar Mein Khidki Rehti Thi, a window lived in the wall, there are the circumstances of this mathematics lecturer. He lives in one of 4 rooms in a 4-room block, and that one room is kitchen, bedroom, receiving room, bicycle place, and toilet. And he rents for 8 rupees, because he's just been married, a toilet on the outside, so that his wife can have some ease. So there is that material world, your kitchen corner, 2 breaks, 4 pans, the little drain that runs from the room outside. And in that space are people able to imagine tenderness between them, or regard between them and their parents, regard between them and the elders they come across. If we look simply at the world outside their real material world, it seems frictionlessly romantic. Well, so you can indeed jump through a window and the path is paved and there are lakes that you can swim in naked. But the weight of the real is sustained under the stone. It's never an escape. This is simply spaces human beings can occupy while they have the thinnest margins and while they make the most difficult choices. And since I haven't been at that limit myself, I can't say how I would regard Shuklaji's belief that imagination nonetheless survives. But at least in his fiction, the sense of balance is strong. I never feel, now we have an interlude. As for the difficulty of translating the local, if one's fidelity is to the hints that are being provided rather than to the reproduction of any reality, then one has more liberty to not be faithful. So in his most recent novel, which I think will be published late this year, early next year, The Silent Place, I've given some characters, somebody who's very sharp of hearing. I've called her Listenera. Now, Listenera is not a Hindi name, and depending on how I present it in the context, it'll live or it won't live. But that's the kind of adaptation one makes. Sometimes the adaptation is not, say, the writer won't allow for it. So I had first translated Neelkant as the Indian roller, which Salim Ali's book tells me it is. And Shuklaji said, no, it's Neelkant. So in the second edition, I corrected it and made it Neelkant. But there's always, we have a Thanedar, but then I use sub-inspector, hoping that there'll be a wider audience for the word Thanedar. For trees, for local customs, it's improvisational. There's no rule of thumb.
Yeah, I have noticed that you left quite a lot of names and names of people, names of places as they are to sort of retain that flavor as well. So that was really nice to see. I'm really looking forward to the translation of Chuppi Jagah, A Silent Place, which is coming out soon. So yeah, really looking forward to that. I was wondering if we could have a short reading at this point before we move on to our last question. Because we're talking about Khilega to Dekhenge and because we're talking about some of the sort of cultural milieu that exists in the book, could we maybe have a reading by Vinod-ji in Hindi and then followed by you as reading the translation of that particular excerpt as well?
मैं खिलेगा तो देखेंगे उपन्यास के 1-2 छोटे अंश पढ़ूंगा। ये अंश कहीं से भी हैं, उपन्यास के बीच से हैं, तो मैं पढ़ता हूं। थानेदार थाने से लगे जिन 2 कमरों में रहता था वह एकदम टूट फूट गया था। उसी का मलबा थाने को उजाड़ बनाता था। मलबे में भटकटैया ढेर उगती और धतूरा भी फूलता। ये दोनों कमरे थाना बनने के बहुत पहले बने, तब भी गिर गए थे। थाने के चारों तरफ की दीवार का घेरा भी जगह जगह टूट फूट गया था। इस घेरे के अंदर कई पेड़ थे। घेरे के किनारे किनारे कहीं कहीं मेहंदी की झाड़ी थी। एक बरगद का पेड़ था। बरगद की शाखाओं में हवाई जड़ें नीचे तक लटकी थी। बरगद इतना बड़ा था कि जमीन के अंदर उसकी जड़ों का फैलाव दूर दूर और थाने के कारण गुप्त लगता था। थाने में 2 कमरे थे, एक बड़ा लॉकअप, दूसरा छोटा लॉकअप। मुंशी जी बरामदे में टेबल डालकर बैठते होंगे। थानेदार छोटे लॉकअप में बैठते होंगे। बड़े लॉकअप में पेशाब टट्टी की निकासी जो छोटे लॉकअप से होते हुए बाहर निकलती थी, उसे थानेदार ने बंद करवा दिया था। निकासी बड़े लॉकअप से ही बाहर की तरफ कर दी गई थी। बड़े लॉकअप में बहुत ऊपर एक छोटा रोशनदान था, जिसमें लोहे की मोटी मोटी 4 सलाखें थीं। रोशनदान ऐसा था कि उसमें केवल बिल्ली या बिल्ली के आकार प्रकार की हवा या उजाला घुस सकता था। दिन में बराबर ऐसा शक होता था कि हवा और उजाला साथ साथ अंदर नहीं घुसते होंगे। कोई न कोई आगे पीछे जरूर रहता होगा। मोटे मोटे सीखचों वाले दरवाजे से खूब उजाला और हवा जाती थी, लेकिन लगता था कि अंदर गया हुआ उजाला और गई हुई हवा लॉकअप में से अब नहीं निकल सकती। कम से कम पूरे दिन भर तो दिन का उजाला लॉकअप में बंद होता और घुटन होती थी। यदि थाने के रोशनदान से एक चिड़िया अंदर घुसती होगी तो उसके पीछे एक बिल्ली जरूर घुसती होगी। चिड़िया दरवाजे के सीखचे से बाहर निकल जाती तो बिल्ली भी उसके पीछे पीछे सीखचे से बाहर निकल जाती। चिड़िया जितनी स्वतंत्र और उन्मुक्त होती, बिल्ली भी उतनी ही स्वतंत्र और उन्मुक्त होती। बिल्ली हमेशा दबोचने वाली ताकत होती।
The watchman lived in a 2-room quarter adjoining the police substation. It had been built more recently than the police substation, but the rooms were in poor condition. The roof sagged, the walls were crumbling. There was a heap of broken bricks and plaster outside, from which apples and prickly bhatkataya had sprung up. The compound wall of the substation had lost a few bricks too, but the vegetation inside was intact. A shrub of henna grew to one side. A banyan tree lifted its many branches to the sky. Its roots, probably on account of the substation nearby, secretly penetrated deep into the ground. There were only 2 rooms in the substation, the big lockup and the small lockup. The clerk functioned from the table he had placed out on the veranda. The substation sub-inspector used the small lockup as his office. Originally, the sewage drain ran from the big lockup through the small lockup. The sub-inspector had the drain rerouted, so it let out directly from the big lockup. The hole between the big lockup and the small lockup was sealed. The other small opening in the big lockup remained, a transom high up along the wall, barred with 4 thick rods. The rods could either let in a cat or cat-sized light and air. It seemed that coming through the transom bars, light and air quarreled over precedence and did not make their way in together. Coming in through the wide bars of the door was easier, but once in, they had trouble getting out again. The light had to spend the entire day locked up. The air grew stale. If a bird ever flew in through the transom, a cat was sure to follow. If the bird found a way out through the bars on the door, the cat did likewise. If the bird was a free spirit, the cat was as much a free spirit. The cat was the power to pounce upon and seize.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Vinod-ji, and thank you, Satti. Were you about to say something? Okay. No, I really enjoyed that. I wish we had time to do more readings. Also from A Window Lived in a Wall. I think that's one of my favorites. But I'm going to wrap up with a final question. And, when I was reading up on Vinod-ji and some of the things that have been said about him by other writers and poets, poet Shumana Roy has said that I have no doubt that Shukla, had he been European, would have been one of the most well-known writers in the world. So I wanted to ask you, how do you feel writers like him will get the credit and recognition that they deserve today? Or do you think that he has got it? Do you feel, his writing deserves more credit and recognition than he has? What are your thoughts on this?
I mean, usually we circulate news of art and music out of love. We share what's been enlivening for us, what's been influential on us. And so the proof of the quality of a work of art is how it deepens, humanizes, awakens the people who come across it. If we love something, we want many, many people to, to see that dawn or to feel that night. To me, say publication or recognition, these are ways of getting something, a precious resource to other people. But there's no such thing as just recognition. These are just routes to individuals experiencing the work. The Nobel Prize says very little about the quality of the writer, but allows many people, invites many people to assess that quality on their own. So if recognition is openness before the work, then anything that brings the work close to people, bookshops, publishers, great editors, prizes, reviews, and of course in our world now, sensitivity to translation as a bridge and a medium, because we know that we live in a world where other people have other realities, and how they fare with that reality matters to us. So making of translation a natural accompaniment to the writing of interesting, vital, creative work in any language seems right for our time. So I'm very happy that you are engaged in that process, and I hope myself to continue translating works that I love.
No, you're right. In fact, the fact that we are having a conversation around translation, there's the series that is focused on translation, all of that is a testament to the fact that more people are engaging with this and more people are recognizing the need to hear different voices. And I think if you talk about Vinod Kumar Shukla ji himself, he's not someone who actually looks for recognition or credit at all. In fact, quite on the contrary. But I am really glad that through your translations and through your hard work over so many years, you've been able to bring his writings and his, his unique voice to readers who wouldn't be able to access him otherwise. Thank you so much for all that you do, Satti, and thank you for your incredible insights. I always learn so much when I speak to you, and this has been a great privilege for me to be in conversation with you today.
Thank you, Mohini.
Thank you. And thank you to JLF and HarperCollins India for giving us this platform. I hope all of you enjoyed the conversation today. And I hope that you'll all get to reading the books if you haven't already.
Thank you so much. It was such a great privilege to hear Vinod-ji's reading. And thank you so much, Mohini and Satti, for that great conversation. And thank you all of you for being such a great audience. If you've liked this session, do share it with your friends and talk about it on your social media channels. And do send us your feedback. We value it highly. And we look forward to seeing you in our next session next Thursday.